Hello and welcome to this presentation on structure in The Handmaid's Tale. Structure is often a frightening word for students, but in terms of what you need to know at school, there are a few simple ideas which we can learn today which will help you in your studies. For our purposes right now, structure just means what the writer includes, what the writer chooses to include in their book. And secondly, the order that the writer puts those things in. And that is literally it. That's all you need to think about. Have a look at this GCSE style question that you'll do when you're in year 11. And it asks, how has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? And then it gives you three things that you need to write about. What the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning, how and why the writer changes this focus, and then any other structural features that interest you. All those bullet points mean is what the writer includes and the order that they're in. For GCSE, you'll be given a text that you've never seen before, but in year 9, you're studying The Handmaid's Tale. And so it will be a really good idea to look at how Margaret Atwood structures the chapters and the pages and the sections of her book. If the first thing you need to write about is what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the extract that you've been given, well, let's have a look at what Margaret Atwood does with her chapters. So this is the beginning of chapter 1. We slept in what had once been the gymnasium. The floor was of varnished wood with stripes and circles painted on it for the games that were formerly played there. This is the beginning of chapter 2. A chair, a table, a lamp. Above, on the white ceiling, a relief ornament in the shape of a wreath. This is the beginning of chapter 3. I go out by the back door into the garden, which is large and tidy, a lawn in the middle, a willow weeping catkins around the edges. This is the beginning of chapter 4. I walk along the gravel path that divides the back lawn neatly like a hair parting. It has rained during the night, the grass to either side is damp, the air humid. This is the beginning of chapter 5. Doubled I walk the street. Though we are no longer in the commander's compound, there are large houses here also. In front of one of them, a guardian is mowing the lawn. The lawns are tidy, the facades are gracious and in good repair. All right, so if you were to get an extract including any beginnings of the first 5 chapters, and you're asked, what the writer focuses your attention on, well, what are you going to say? What do all of those chapter beginnings have in common? The answer, of course, is all of those chapters and most of the chapters in the book start with a detailed description of place. And specifically, what it is that they describe. Well, this is a dystopian book, and so you'd think that the descriptions of place would be torture chambers or would be rain-soaked run-down streets, but that's not what we have here. We have a setting which is quite beautiful. There's a focus on nature, of plants, of the weather, the sun, the rain, and there's a focus on peace, quiet and stillness in all of these descriptions. So why might Margaret Atwood choose to include descriptions of these places? Well, perhaps, it obviously depends on what's being described, but perhaps it's to make Gilead seem attractive on the surface. Don't forget that Gilead is intended to be a utopia. It's God's perfect land. And so it makes sense that it looks nice. The houses are attractive, the gardens are attractive, the centre of town is attractive. The rooms in the commander's house are attractive. And perhaps then what Margaret Atwood is trying to say is that this is a place of horror, of torture, of rape, of suffering and of pain. But the casual visitor, the casual tourist, like those Japanese tourists in the first chapters, they would think the place was very beautiful. Perhaps those descriptions are there to make Gilead seem dull. There's a huge amount of boredom in this. Offred, as a prisoner, doesn't have very much to do most of the time. And so it's very pretty, but it's also very dull. Or perhaps all those descriptions of Serena Joy's garden, or the descriptions of the neat lawns, symbolize nature and fertility, and how the rulers of Gilead have tamed and trimmed nature and bent it to their will, in the same way that they have tamed women's fertility and bent it to their will. The place is pretty, but it is also June's prison and personal hellscape. And Aunt Lydia, among others, tell June that she's privileged, that she's one of the lucky ones because she gets to live in Gilead and not the colonies. And so there's this awful paradox where, even though she's subject to these to this captivity and torture and rape that she's put through, she's actually one of the lucky ones. And so the attractive descriptions of Gilead just show her alienation. This place is her hell, but her hell is quite pretty. Let's look at the second bullet point of the question then, how and why the writer changes this focus as the source develops. And so if you get a source which begins with a description of a place, well, what does the writer go on to talk about next? Have a look at this from chapter 1. Aunt Sarah and Aunt Elizabeth patrolled. They had electric cattle prods slung on thongs from their leather belts. Have a look at this from chapter 2. I know why there's no glass in the front of the watercolour picture of blue irises, and why the window opens only partly, and why the glass in it is shatterproof. It isn't running away they're afraid of. We wouldn't get that far. It's those other escapes, the ones you can open in yourself, given a cutting edge. Or how about this from chapter 4? Last week they shot a woman right about here. She was a Martha. She was fumbling in her robe for her pass, and they thought she was hunting for a bomb. So what do all those passages have in common? Well, they all present horror and violence and suffering and pain in some way. And so in terms of the structure of these extracts, it starts with a detailed description of a pretty dull place, and then continues with an image of horror. Now, we call that a juxtaposition, a contrast. The beautiful is put next to the horrible. Perhaps Margaret Atwood has done that to remind us that Gilead is very pretty and very dull, but it is also a violent, unjust dystopia in which people are murdered, raped, tortured, and life is very cheap. Those violent images remind us that June is in danger. It creates that sense of danger and menace. But to me, this is the main thing. June, in this dystopia, has to deal with beauty and horror side by side all day, every day. She lives in this pleasant house in a pleasant room. On the surface, she has a pleasant life. She goes shopping. She sits in her room. But there is this ever-present violence. And that is Margaret Atwood's dystopia. Now let's look at some other changes of focus from the early chapters of the book. We stood face to face for the first time 5 weeks ago when I arrived at this posting. The Guardian from the previous posting brought me to the front door. Luke and I used to walk together sometimes along these streets. We used to talk about buying a house like one of these, an old big house, and fixing it up. What do you notice about both of those quotes? Well, they change in time. And this book is full of flashbacks and memories. There's a word for that. It's called analepsis, where a book jumps around in time. There are three timelines, three time zones in this book. The first one is Offred's present life as a handmaid, living in the commander's house, going shopping, and that part of her story. But then we frequently get memories of her training as a handmaid, and there's a clue that if Offred's mind is going to wander back to her training, she will say something that Aunt Lydia said. And so whenever you see Aunt Lydia, you know that the book's gone back in time to June's memories of training. And then the third timeline goes even further back. It's when Offred wasn't called Offred, she was called June, and she was a free woman in modern America in the time before there was this state called Gilead, and she was free. She had a job, she had books, she had friends, she had a husband called Luke, and she had a daughter. Let's have a look at these quotes. Don't call me Mom, she said irritably. You're not a Martha. I didn't ask what I was supposed to call her because I could see that she hoped I would never have the occasion to call her anything at all. What if I were to come at night when he's on duty alone, though he would never be allowed such solitude, and permit him beyond my white wings? What if I were to peel off my red shroud and show myself to them, by the uncertain light of the lanterns? When Margaret Atwood changes the focus to quotes like that, what she's doing is she's focusing on June's thoughts and feelings. So it's less about what happens and more about what June thinks. The effect of that, of course, depends hugely what it is that she's thinking and feeling at the time. But in general, perhaps Margaret Atwood does this to humanise her. We have to like her and we have to care about her. And finding out what she thinks and how she feels helps us do that. Furthermore, June is a hero. She's gone through unimaginable pain and trauma. She's had her daughter taken away from her at gunpoint. She doesn't know whether her husband is in prison being tortured or has been executed. She is a prisoner. She is raped and dehumanized. And despite the torture, despite all that degradation, she has retained her independent spirit. She thinks back to her previous life. She thinks thoughts that she's not supposed to think, and that makes us love her and care about her even more. Very often, June's thoughts are very, very uncertain and confused, and that just shows that she is not the master of her own destiny. She doesn't really understand what's happening around her. She's scared, she's lonely, and she's alienated. And Margaret Atwood narrates her thoughts and feelings in order to show us that. Let's look at some other changes of focus that we get in the early chapters. Nobody asking you, Cora said. Anyways, what could you do, supposing? Go to the colonies, Rita said. They have the choice. With the young women and starve to death and Lord knows what all, said Cora. Catch you. Or how about this one? I want to see as little of you as possible, she said. I expect you feel the same way about me. Or how about this one? The war is going well, I hear, she says. Praise be, I reply. We've been sent good weather, which I receive with joy. So what is it that Margaret Atwood is choosing to include here? Well, it's dialogue, people talking. The effect of that depends very much on what's being said, to whom and by whom. But again, in general, the dialogue can add background information. It can show us that through no fault of her own, June is despised by Serena Joy. She's helpless and vulnerable. And the conversation between the two handmaids shows us that she's lonely. She can't trust anybody. She can't say what she really, really thinks and feels to other people. So her and Ofglen have these, you might call, banal conversations in which they don't really say anything meaningful to each other. So to summarize, what are the structural features that you will write about when you're answering a structure question on The Handmaid's Tale? First of all, detailed descriptions of place, contrasts and juxtapositions, an ellipsis, a focus on June's thoughts and feelings, and dialogue. I hope you found this useful and that you've enjoyed it. Good luck with your studies and enjoy the book.